Monica Daily Press in the event that some of y'all didn't read it. And I also will drop in the link to the letter. But again, this is the letter that we submitted to the Santa Monica Daily Press. It seems that our nation is finally trying to face generational consequences created by the Jim Crow era institutionalism of systemic racism. As we know, Santa Monica has its own ghosts in the closet. While California cities such as Burbank, Glendale, Pasadena, San Jose, and Redwood City find themselves also contending with shared racist histories. Past wrongs include exclusionary practices against non-whites, often resulting in destroying communities, redlining neighborhoods, and supporting sundown towns. Blacks were warned to stay away from sundown towns, which is why they had that name, following sunset, or face the wrath of unspeakable discriminatory acts. And by the way, Glendale was one of those sundown towns. During the 19th century, Santa Monica initially presented great opportunities for African-American owned businesses, such as La Bonita Bathhouse, Thurman's Rest a While Apartments, the Dewdrop Inn, and Cafe for Inkwell's beachgoers. However, all of that changed during the 1920s when local chapters of the Ku Klux Klan sought to prevent non-whites from thriving in Santa Monica. Ultimately, the city enforced a Caucasian clause with systemic policies preventing African-American residents from owning businesses or homes by the beach. Yes, all of this took place prior to displacing those by the Belmar and 10 freeway Pico corridor areas in the 1950s and 60s. In addition to implementing right to return policies, our city council should also issue a formal apology by way of an official resolution acknowledging deep-seated racial injustices committed in Santa Monica. This formal apology must and should address all racial inequities inflicted upon Santa Monica's diverse residents. Racially charged discriminatory practices extended to all non-white Santa Monicans, therefore prohibiting the selling, transferring, or leasing of property to persons of the African or Negro, Japanese, Chinese, Jewish, or Hebrew races or their descendants. Let's be clear, despite the Supreme Court declaring restrictive covenants unconstitutional in 1948, Santa Monica formally implemented far-reaching discriminatory policies during the 1950s and 60s. Racist tactics included harsh discrimination toward Japanese American Santa Monicans returning from internment camps, with countless unable to reclaim lost homes and worldly possessions. Jewish American residents also experienced redlining and covenant restrictions when attempting to purchase homes and run businesses outside of the Pico area. To this day, in a city where 32% of the land is zoned for single-family homes, few Black and Brown people live in R1 zones, a fact attributed to single-family zoning, or R1, which prohibits apartments or multifamily housing dwellings. And these are dwellings that are sorely missed, and they're needed for Santa Monica's low-income residents. How can providing a right to return policy fairly compensate for decades of injustice? How will we ensure diversity and inclusion are maintained and thereby prevent further generational pain and suffering? In good conscience, Santa Monica must and should acknowledge and formally pass a resolution that apologizes for its racist past and continued harm against people of color and marginalized communities. Commitment to systemic change begins at the point of awareness. Santa Monica should publicly take ownership for contributions towards its erroneous ways. October of 2020 saw the city of Glendale publicly apologize and pass a resolution to address its history as a sundown town and prevalent systemic issues. This past October, San Jose instituted a similar apology for enforcing anti-Chinese policies including the destruction of the Second Market Street Chinatown. Will Santa Monica publicly apologize for its racist past? Is a formal apology from Santa Monica City Council needed? Reimagining an inclusive Santa Monica begins with acknowledging and submitting a formal apology for decades of prevalent racial injustice and discrimination against not just Black African Americans, but also Indigenous Americans, Latinx Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Jewish Americans, and the LGBTQ community. A formal apology, a resolution of this magnitude, intentionally acknowledges, accepts, and commits to righting the wrongs of the past by ensuring a more diverse and inclusive Santa Monica. Again, this is the letter that the Committee for Racial Justice, our steering committee, submitted in the Santa Monica Daily Press. I'm now going to hand off to Janet.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. I'm Janet McKee, and I'm also a member of the steering committee. And I know that many of you might have reactions to that letter, and you may have reactions at the end of this meeting. Tonight is only the beginning. Right to return is just the beginning of what needs to be done, as many of us know. There are many groups and people who believe that more reparations are needed. There are many groups thinking about what can be done, and some are making plans. Many of you realize that there are some people hearing about this right to return either may think that it's too much already, we shouldn't be doing that, or they might think now it's taken care of. But those of us who realize that this shouldn't be the end need to work together to make more change happen. We need a coalition that will bring folks together so we will be more effective. If you're interested in being a part of the Reparations Coalition, please put your name and email in the chat and notate coalition in the chat. And the way we have chat set up tonight is that it will go to one of the co-hosts. So if you could have that go to me, it would be very helpful, but it can actually go to any of us. Just put your name and email in the chat with the word coalition if you'd like to be a part of it. Thank you. And we do have a couple of updates this evening. The first one is from Michelle Wittig, and the second one is from Tara Bariskas. Michelle?
Great, thank you. Yes, in the spirit of righting the wrongs of the past, I'm going to summarize very briefly 8 new laws that have to do with the reform of policing. And I think it's fair to say that the majority of these 8 laws address issues that have implications locally. It's been our experience in the past 5 or 6 years that the laws that I'm going to be summarizing definitely will change things locally. So the first one is a law that says that officers can lose their badges for serious misconduct. The second one has to do with making sure that techniques that involve a serious risk of what's called positional asphyxia, or I guess you would say suffocation, are now illegal. The third one is that officers must immediately report incidents of excessive force that they witness, and there are new requirements to intervene in those incidents. The fourth one has to do with transparency of disciplinary and other kinds of personnel records that are now subject to greater disclosure under the California Public Records Act. The fifth one is that law enforcement agencies have new limits on posting to social media the booking photos of someone who is arrested for a non-violent crime. The sixth one defines and bans law enforcement gangs and makes participation in such gangs grounds for dismissal. The seventh one is called AB 48, and it prohibits law enforcement officers from firing rubber bullets and tear gas indiscriminately into crowds or groups of persons. The eighth one is not a new law, but it will be newly applicable to Santa Monica. As a small law enforcement agency, we will now be covered by the Racial and Identity Profiling Act of 2015. This mandates that police officers will need to report their perceived race, gender, sexual orientation, and a number of other group categories of every person that they officially stop as a pedestrian or in a traffic stop, and to report that data to the state of California. Not only that, but the data then will come back to Santa Monica, and it must be publicly posted. So in the future, I will probably be reporting on the progress that Santa Monica is making with regard to this law, because it goes into effect as of January 1st, 2022. Thanks so much for the time to bring you up to date on these new laws. I think there is hope for thousands of Californians because of them. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And now Tara will give us an update on the Housing Committee.
Hi, everyone. So a couple updates. First of all, the city of Santa Monica has issued a right to return policy that will allow people who have been displaced from the Belmar or the 10 freeway construction to apply for affordable housing and get priority on the waiting list. So make sure and let people know about that so we can get the word out. So for those who were disadvantaged through those activities. The other thing I wanted to let everyone know is that there is a new ballot initiative in the city of LA called United to House LA. And it will be a commercial transfer tax that's going to be going on the November ballot that would raise potentially about $500 million a year for affordable housing. It's a really significant bill. And I will put in the chat information about this ballot initiative. Hope we can get everyone to get excited about it, and when the time comes to help get this measure passed. So that's a really exciting thing happening in the city of LA. The other thing is in City Council on Tuesday evening, there will be an item regarding affordable housing development on the parking structure 3 property. It has been pretty controversial, but if you are a housing advocate who wants to see city-owned property developed for affordable housing, we would appreciate it if you would want to call in to the Tuesday evening council meeting and just let the city council know that you strongly believe that that site should be developed for affordable housing. So those are updates from the Housing Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. Appreciate that. And now we are going to head to our panel. We have an incredible panel. We're going to introduce each one separately, and then they'll speak for just briefly for a few moments. And then the next will be introduced and so on. It's an incredible panel, and we could spend a whole workshop on each one of them, but we really have a whole slew of them at the same time for you tonight because we wanted to give you an overview. This won't be our last workshop on reparations, but it is going to be a very thorough introduction. If you have questions for any of the panelists as they're speaking, and you write the question in the chat and direct it to Robbie Jones or to Angela Scott, and it'll be a part of the Q&A after they all speak. But I have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Tim Conley. Our first panelist is Timothy Conley, who is Professor T, is a Los Angeles-based filmmaker. He currently serves as the executive producer and owner of 67 Entertainment, a television, film, and a new media entertainment company, presently producing a documentary film about the godfather of West Coast hip hop, Grandmaster Lonzo. In addition to filmmaking, Timothy is launching a new podcast show with Professor Mark DJ Seatontel Hawkins called The Politics of Hip Hop Culture in 2022. Timothy is the Department Chair of Cinema and Film at Columbia College Hollywood. He has held teaching appointments in a variety of schools and universities. He has researched, developed, and taught digital literacy, media literacy, film, and media studies courses for nearly 10 years. A retired professional athlete, Timothy had the bounty and privilege to play in the National Football League and the Seattle Seahawks. Timothy has a true passion for engaging and executing pedagogical advancement in the digital space and grassroots community organizing. He currently serves with me as a board member on the Santa Monica Bay Area Human Relations Council, and we welcome Tim Connolly to our panel. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm always a bit embarrassed when things are read or highlight what I've done in my life and my career. I'm always about doing the work. So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I will keep this as brief as possible. I know we want to keep it to around 5 minutes or so. So again, thank you for having me. And I also want to thank all the freedom fighters today with us in attendance and around the world. And I'll do my best to keep this brief. However, you give a teacher a microphone or a platform and we are off and running. So I want to get to the question, and there has been a great introduction today about reparations and reparative justice. Why reparations and reparative justice? The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "It is not possible to be in favor of justice for some people and not be in favor of justice for all people." And I really want us to think about that as we think about what has been going on, right? Sadly, it took the lives of individuals such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many more for us to really start waking up and thinking about what needs to change, for what folks have been fighting for years. So why reparations? Author, producer, and freedom fighter Ta-Nehisi Coates, in a 2014 article in The Atlantic, shared 200 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, and 35 years of racist housing policy. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. The International Center for Transitional Justice shares that reparations for victims of human rights violations are meant to recognize and address the harm suffered and acknowledge wrongdoing. Reparations serve to acknowledge the legal obligation of a state or individuals or group to repair the consequences of violations, either because it directly committed them or failed to prevent them. They also express to victims and society more generally that the state is committed to addressing the root causes of past violations and ensuring they do not happen again. In some of those cities, including shocking for me to find out a couple years ago that Glendale was a sundown town. I experienced that in Oklahoma at the University of Oklahoma as an undergrad and student athlete. There was a sundown town just 20 miles from my campus. Shocking. I was told never to go there. Still in 1997, even though it was not supposed to be sundown towns at that point. All right, so the Consumer Finances Survey shared that Black Americans possess 2.6% of the nation's wealth and make up 13% of the population. The average Black household has a net worth $800,000 lower than the average white household, that is, and wealth equity and equality is the starting point. Let me say that again. Wealth, equity, and equality is the starting point, folks, to equity for the descendants of the barbaric, horrible chattel slavery in America. A $10 to $12 trillion federal expenditure to achieve closing the gap of Black and white wealth is the argument by many scholars, including the folks over at the Brookings Institute. An $800,000 increase could change the landscape per Black household for home ownership, education, economic security, and something not talked about enough, financial literacy, and my most cherished research, digital literacy, right? So social policies enacted can assist in establishing and maintaining equity in the financial sphere and much more. You see, equity in the wealth gap fights against the intergenerational economic impact of white supremacy, excuse me. A federal reparations package for Black Americans should include public benefits that build wealth and eliminate debt, like sort of what was proposed recently, the Harriet Tubman Community Investment Act, right? Looking again at education, home ownership, and business ownership, to name a few. Now, looking at education, what is closest to me, Tuition remission for public or private college and universities to reduce racial disparities would be key. 40% of Blacks compared to 30% of whites have student loan debt due to subprime loans. An example of how to shift this is what happened, or what's happening, I should say, at Georgetown University and a few others, right? The descendants of the enslaved sold by the folks there at Georgetown are now entitled to full rights and benefits to obtain college degrees. Down payment grants aid Black Americans also with equity in their homes. So a housing revitalization grant will help with refurbishing existing Black neighborhood homes. So this is direct correlation, if we think about this, to assisting equitable value for homes and neighborhoods. Now, looking at some things globally, I don't have a lot of time here, but a 2016 United Nations report argued that people of African descent in the US are owed reparations. This came from the United Nations. International support from other sources could benefit the national movement. For example, African nations could collectively refuse American corporate entry into the countries until the US adopts Black reparations for citizens who have been subjected to slavery or inferior status, etc. And looking at those folks who think that they had nothing to do with this, oftentimes across the ocean, the British government has yet to make reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. And the 21 billion in today's money that was made, while it paid Kenya, interestingly enough, 31 million for atrocities committed against the Mau Mau independence fighters of the 1950s into the 1960s. So that is just an example of there is money's available, but when is it going to be made available for the atrocities for all involved in chattel slavery, right? And the growth of the European continent, which I want to argue sometimes is not a continent by definition. That's a whole nother conversation. Now, I want to stop here. I don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to really just sort of dive into some things and think about how we could shift the tide, things we could do in terms of reparations. And I want to look at this. This first picture on the left is the residents of Santa Monica's Pico neighborhood watching the construction from this picture from the LA Times of the 10 freeway in 1964 being built. About 600 families in the predominantly Black community lost their homes when the freeway was built. And this comes from, again, this picture is in the LA Times from the Santa Monica Museum. A lot was mentioned earlier about some of the things happening, but I don't think it's enough. A right to return policy is just the beginning. But what about the folks that lost their homes? What about the folks that lost their future in those homes, or folks who worked as hard as they could with all the housing covenants and redlining at the time, not to be able to return, when their families or descendants left destitute for years to come, and others being allowed the American dream, not those families, as mentioned, not just the Black families, the Latinx families, and many more. Now, this picture on the right as I close, the California governor apologizes for the city's seizure of the first West Coast resort of Black people, which almost certainly would have made their heirs millionaires. Now, we have learned in recent weeks and months, and last year as well, that there has been movement towards and returning this property to its rightful heirs. And I had the bounty and privilege of watching one such demonstration when Janice Hahn spoke about this last year. So the Bruce family in Bruce's Beach is just one example, but there's so many more things to talk about that I don't have time to. I'm going to stop here. I know I've gone over my time, but thank you for allowing me just to engage with you all in this panel discussion today.
Thank you, Tim. That was, we were definitely going to swing back to you for Q&A session. So next I'm going to hand off to Robbie, who's going to introduce our next panel. I would say everyone grab a paper and pencil. I'm over here jotting down notes. If you're on your digital device, type up some thoughts here. Tim, I don't want to be so forward in ask, but I would really like to see your deck. Your PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if you want to make that available or just I would just say some of the things that were on there, even just the definition and stuff, some of those things are very powerful. And,
Sure.
and if you don't mind sharing some of that, that would be awesome as well. But
Sure.
right now I am going to hand off to Robbie, who's going to hand off to our next presenter. Thank you.
Wow. Tim, that was amazing. Amazing. And yeah, Bruce's Beach. And my background is Inkwell Beach. And if you haven't seen it, you need to see it. You need to Google it. You need to find out about the history of Inkwell Beach, a place of celebration and pain for Black folks in Santa Monica. We had some great times there, but there's a lot of history behind it too. So this next person, I have the honor of introducing, even though I know all of the panelists that I know of, some of the panelists, but I know personally Tim Conley and this person, Nichelle Monroe. Michelle Monroe, an accomplished vocalist and a beautiful vocalist, as I may say, whose grandparents lost their family home when the 10 freeway was built. She currently works at Santa Monica College and was featured in a recent article, and you got to get it. Look at that article, in a recent article in the LA Times about Black people seeking to return to Santa Monica to live under the new right to return policy. Now, Nichelle used to be my neighbor. That's how I first came in contact with her. But my family, having such generational history here, over 70 years, 80 years history here, knew Nichelle's family as well. And actually her cousin or auntie, one of them, or both of them, were my babysitters. So anyway, without further ado, I'll let her tell you more about herself. Is Nichelle, as we call her in the neighborhood, Nene Monroe.
Hello, everyone. Happy Sunday. I hope you're having a wonderful beginning to your week. I'm really honored to join this panel about what reparations would look like for Black people who have had land stolen. I consider eminent domain a euphemism for theft, and call me that lady. But my family, my grandparents, this is on my mother's paternal side. We have been in Santa Monica since the turn of the last century, so the early 1900s. The Brunsons, that's our name, are considered one of the pioneer Black families of Santa Monica. Now, when I was approached for the interview for the Los Angeles Times, I gained some more insight into what happened to our family way back when. When I was very young, I remember my grandfather, Vernon Brunson, telling me about how they had a duplex where the 10 freeway is now, or close to where the 10 freeway is now. He talked about how they just took it and did not really compensate for the worth of the duplex which they owned. My family was lucky. They had other property in Santa Monica, so they ended up moving there when their home was demolished for the 10 freeway. This was as I said, a duplex which the family lived in one unit and they rented out the other. So that's generational wealth. My great uncle Donald Brunson used to live on 5th Street, and his home was stolen for the Civic Center area construction. So that's twice in one family, generational wealth taken. So my question is, for Santa Monica, the city of Santa Monica, my beloved birthplace, is what does reparations actually look like? What is the right of return? What else is on the docket? Because it seems to me that if you're having a right of return for descendants whose families were displaced through state-sponsored theft, eminent domain, that you're going to give them now cuts in line to pay rent at an inflated price. I don't care how much they cut it, it's still inflated. It's Santa Monica. Let's face it, a lot of the property values are not really what they're purported to be, but it's just people who've set the limits, who've said this is what this is worth, and then everybody jumps on the bandwagon. And that's why we have such inflated rents, and that's why there has to be affordable housing. What does that look like? What? Okay, so if I come back, yay, I'm coming back. They said I could have a new apartment in Santa Monica. What am I entitled to? I'm a single person. Do I just have to have a 1-bedroom, or do I get a 2-bedroom? What if I don't want this as a consolation for my generational wealth being stolen? What if I want a home? What if I want a condo or a townhouse or a home? That's my question. Also, I want to know, okay, if you accept that, does that mean you're not in line for anything else? What exactly is this? It kind of feels like a little bitty bone being thrown to people who've essentially been suffering because they don't have the financial stability that they might have had they had their generational wealth intact. So my questions have to do with that. What if I decide to do, I personally think if land was stolen, land needs to be given back. You don't say, here, you can pay rent. Who am I paying rent to? How is that a consolation, really? I get to live in a well-traveled and famous beach town, location. But what does that really mean for me as a citizen? What does that tell me about the city of Santa Monica, or even the state, who will let something like that suffice? I could see if you lived in an apartment and the apartment was taken through eminent domain, you were just renting a unit. Now you get to rent another unit. Okay. But if you've had a building stolen, how is an apartment consolation? I'm going to leave that right there.
Thank you, Michelle. I think you, of course, brought up some food for fodder, as they say, and things that we can dive into a little bit later this evening. But that is definitely a testimony, like you said, and a double one for 2 instances where this occurred. I now have the pleasure, I have to transition. You left me in my feelings, Michelle. I'm now going to transition to introducing our next panelist, who I am proud to introduce. That is our own Mayor Pro Tem, Kristen Mccallum. She is the first Black woman to serve as a council member. Her stated priorities on the City Council are economic recovery and justice, reimagining public safety that protects everyone in their homes and out in the community, and increase opportunities for historically disenfranchised and vulnerable communities. Kristen returned to her hometown here of Santa Monica after serving in the Obama administration as a presidential appointee in the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Executive Office of the President. She is currently the Executive Director for Getty House Foundation. I now present our Mayor Pro Tem, Kristen Mccallum.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, CRJ, for having this discussion tonight. Thank you for inviting me to participate in it. Michelle's comment, I'm still struggling with a lot of it. On the one hand, I found myself deeply emotional about everything that happened to her family. And of course, I had read the article and was familiar with the story, but then with sort of my counsel hat, really thinking through, and I think what I was asked to come here to talk about and be part of the conversation about tonight is really kind of what the city can do going forward. So firstly, I think it's worth noting, and I'll speak for myself, and I know Mayor Himmelrich is here tonight. I would say that based on conversations we've had, she's aligned in this as well. And I think a majority of our council is that this is a first step. This is by no means the end. And Michelle said it so emotionally, and it was very heartfelt. And so I feel so badly for anyone that lost their home and lost the opportunity for that generational wealth to be built. But a lot of the time in Santa Monica, I find that one of the things we are thinking about is the most vulnerable amongst us right now. And I think that when it came down to a policy that we could enact right now to help some of the most vulnerable, at least the way I thought about this was, we have people who rented in those areas at that time and received absolutely nothing, $0 from any government when they were evicted from their rental units and had to go find housing elsewhere. And some of those people, we believe, and their descendants may still be living in situations where they are having trouble accessing an affordable roof over their head in any way. And so I think that, and I'm speaking for myself only, I think that was this initial sort of the intent of this initial policy. What I've really appreciated about everything now that we're approaching January 18th and when people can start applying, and the coverage that's gotten out there nationally, is just people that are reaching out and saying, my family lived at such and such, and we lost our home, and I now live in this part of Georgia, and my whole story in Santa Monica, where I spent much of my life, was so deep. My high school mentor remained my mentor for years to come. My wife and I are now retired, and I always wanted to return to my hometown and to be able to live there. And if you could please send me more information on the program, I'd really appreciate it, because basically I want to end my life where I started my life. And I read stuff like that and I hear it. And many of you know that my father grew up here in Santa Monica. The 10 freeway is my next door neighbor in the home where I currently live and where I grew up. My father had the privilege of being able to buy this home in 1971 with the GI Bill. It was still at that time, and remains, one of the only affordable areas in Santa Monica that was accessible, and he was able to do that through the GI Bill. That's not an option for people anymore. For normal, middle class, people, working people, hardworking people. It is not affordable to live in Santa Monica anymore. I live in the house I grew up with, and I live in a multi-generational household with both of my parents. I cannot afford to buy in Santa Monica. I think that we started with this policy, and I always try to remember to mention the great work that former council member McKee did to get us to where we are right now with something. But this was an effort of many activists like yourselves, like those of you in CRJ, to get us to a starting point. I believe that we will see in the years to come, as this community begins to recover from COVID-19 and the economic impacts of this terrible pandemic on our community, we will see more opportunities. Ownership opportunities, I think, is in our future. I believe that, you know, people have wanted to, there's been talk for many years about a community bank. I think things like this are the types of partnerships that a bank like that would be able to do with our city to bring about true reparations for everyone that was displaced. And I also think that's important. I really appreciate what Professor Connolly raised about and Angela in her opening remarks about all of the communities that have been impacted by the displacement. And I want to be very clear, as a Black woman, as a Black Santa Monican, and recognizing the atrocities that this community, our country, and the world have presented for Black people, I will also say that this city did not stop there, and it displaced and did not always treat many others the way it should have. And I believe that an apology will be forthcoming. I believe that the policies that we're enacting will also be intended for anyone that was displaced. So I'll leave it at that. My goal was always to leave as much time for questions. And so I thank you all, Joanne, Robbie, CRJ, for inviting me. Janet, thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel and hearing your questions tonight.
Thank you, Mayor, Pro Tem Mayor Mccallum. Kristen, in my mind, you're my best friend, but we're working on that. So I'm going to hand off again to Robbie, who is going to hand off to our next panelist. And again, this is a very thought-provoking conversation. If you have a question, please place it in the chat. We will circle back. Right now, we're just doing a real quick intro with our panelists, and then we're going to dive in deeper. So if you do have a question, place it in the chat, and we will circle back to that. So I'm handing off now to Robbie.
Okay, wow, this is it's very emotional, right? For some of us, all of everybody who's spoken so far, and I know it's just gonna get even more emotional. We're trying to get through this. You know, wow, okay, just read. Yeah, we also have two members of the California Reparations Task Force. I hope I said that right, because I only attended one of their meetings. But I was so privileged by a friend of I'm all discombobulated, classmate of my daughter, Brandy, and Tim and Christian at Santa Monica High School, Kelly Farish. And I know Kelly's on here. Hi, Kelly. Kelly texted me and messaged me and said, you got to get on this call with the California Reparations Task Force. I talked to them about Santa Monica. I talked to them about you. I know the work that you guys are doing. Please try to get on this call. I went on the call and I was amazed. And I'm not going to take up a lot of time. Just tell you, we have two of the people that were on our panel tonight that were on this call. And so just gear up. Just also to remind you guys, put your questions in the chat, whoever you have questions for. We are not recognizing raised hands tonight. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to them. So we have the two members, and the first one happens to be Camilla Moore, a reparatory justice scholar and attorney, is chair. She's the chair of this working group. Her master thesis explored the intersections between international law and reparatory justice for the transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and their legacies. I just let her talk. I can't even really say anymore. And then whatever else you need, just Google it. Y'all know how I roll. Okay. Miss Moore.
You know, I haven't seen her in here. I've been looking.
Okay. All right. Well, are we able to go to you, Miss? Okay, so Angela needs to introduce you. And
she was here.
Maybe she got.
She was in with us before we opened to the audience.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she was.
Okay, well, let's just move on to Dr. Grills and Angela.
Yep, and we can circle back. Thank you, Robbie. I am now introducing Dr. Cheryl Grills, who's also a member of the California Reparations Task Force. Dr. Grills holds a PhD. She is a clinical psychologist with a current emphasis in community psychology. She's on the faculty of Loyola Marymount University for the past 34 years. She is a professor of psychology, director of their Psychology Applied Research Center, and president's professor in their College of Liberal Arts. Dr. Grills is a national past president of the Association of Black Psychologists and currently serves as commissioner and vice chair of Los Angeles County Civil Brand Commission for Institutional Inspections, which focuses on conditions and practices within county jails and correctional facilities. She also served as the co-executive director of the Los Angeles County Blue Ribbon Commission on Child Protection, whose work led to significant reforms in LA County's approach to child welfare, including the establishment of an Office of Child Protection. She serves as a research principal investigator on several multi-site projects addressing mental health disparities, social determinants of health, positive youth development, and COVID's impact on communities of color nationally. Her work in the area of racial stress focuses on research and training associated with racism, racial stress, implicit bias, and the development of community-based self-help models to address the negative effects of racism on people of African ancestry in the US and globally. Dr. Grill's research interests, publications, and projects include African psychology, African-centered models of treatment engagement with African Americans, community psychology, community mental health, and program evaluation with community-based organizations engaged in social justice efforts, community change, and prevention on a host of social issues. Dr. Grills was appointed to the Reparations Task Force by Governor Gavin Newsom. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Cheryl Grills.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's embarrassing. It's like the question that comes to mind every time I hear that is, do I have a life? Do I sleep? But in any event, I want to say thank you so much, Robbie and Angela and the Committee for Racial Justice, for inviting me to share some information with you about the work we're doing with the California Reparations Task Force. And I have to say, I am so impressed with what you have launched here in Santa Monica, and the kind of collaborative, cross-race collaborative effort that you're engaging in. You're a model. And because of what I'm seeing, I'm going to make an ask of you to help us with something in particular on the reparations task force, but I'll come back to that later. Now, because I am a psychologist, I'd like to start with a little bit of grounding and context for reparations from the vantage point of psychology, mental health, and well-being. Let me start with two quotes. The first quote is from James Baldwin, one of my favorites. And Baldwin said, "People are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them." We're dealing with reparations because we are trapped in this historical reality that America has had an incredibly difficult challenge with addressing. We don't know how to talk about race. We don't know how to face up to the issues of race and racism that have been at the very heart and soul of this country's founding and its evolution. And then the second quote I want to share is from Zora Neale Hurston. And she said, "The present was an egg laid by the past that had the future inside its shell." That to me is so profound a statement about what we have been dealing with, what we are currently dealing with, and if we don't get our act together, what our children are going to have to deal with because we didn't handle our business as a society. So let me try to give you a point of departure to connect with why this reparations is so important. And it's important, yes, in terms of redress that may include monetary issues or return of land, et cetera, but it's got to be more than that, right? If we're really going to change the DNA of this country, it has got to be more than that. So let's use something that we're all dealing with. All of us have been dealing with COVID, right? Nobody in this space has not been dealing with COVID. So I want you to think for a moment about the stress that you have been experiencing related to COVID. And there are different ways that COVID has stressed us. There's stress from not knowing where the danger lies every time we step out of our door. It could be a person, it could be something that we touch, it could be a space that we go into, but danger is all around us, right? And we can't always see it, and we definitely can't control it fully. We try with the masks and all and the vaccines, but that's not 100%. So danger is lurking everywhere. Secondly, there's stress from being at the whims of this thing, COVID, right? It does what it wants to do, and we can't negotiate with it. Third, there's stress at having our behavior controlled by COVID, right? We have to wear masks, we have to get vaccine, we can't go into certain spaces and places if we haven't gotten the vaccine. Our jobs are telling us what we have to do, the government is telling us what we have to do, businesses are telling us what we have to do, and we may not always agree what they're telling us that we have to do, and that's stressful. And then there's just the plain old stress of our mortality at the whims of COVID, that it's like at any given moment, we could be facing the end of our life. We could be facing the end of the lives of our children, our mates, our family members, our elders. So now you can kind of get in touch with what that's like, what that feels like. Then I want you to multiply that 1,000-fold and then extend that over 400 plus years. Then you will have stepped into what life has been like in America for Black people. Magnify by 1,000, stretch it across 400 years. So what was done to Black folks, to African Americans in this country is unparalleled in its assault on humanity and dignity of an entire group of people. It's unparalleled in its breadth, its duration, and its sheer cruelty and viciousness, right? The fight for reparations is a fight to redress that. But it's also a fight for the soul and the evolution of this country. This is not just about Black people. If we can't figure this out, there's that saying, today they came for me, tomorrow it's you, right? And so for Black folks, it's a struggle to be seen as human beings, to be treated with the same dignity and respect given to other people, to have justice. And it's really fundamentally a struggle to just be, to be who we are as Black people and as people of African ancestry. It's a struggle for an empowered existence in a society infused with assumptions of inferiority and intolerance of difference. And in this 400 years, we've endured multiple barriers to the affirmation of the humanity of our children, of our families, of our community, of our ancestral homeland, Africa. And we have been dealing with this unmitigated, multi-generational assault on our freedom, our dignity, and our humanity with no support from the government. In fact, the government is that nefarious COVID virus out there that we don't know what it's going to do and how it's going to act and how it's going to treat us. So we're talking about prolonged suffering across generations in spite of our incredible and indelible resilience, right? And it has been so, it has had such a deep and profound impact on us that it has impacted literally the genetic makeup of our responses to stress. All you have to do is look at the research in epigenetics, and you'll see that not only am I going to carry the stress that I have to deal with in this present moment of racism, I'm carrying the stress of generations prior, right? It's literally in my DNA, and it changes my stress response cycle. And I have to say, Michelle, before I forget, you know, when you were speaking, you triggered me just a smidge. And the reason you triggered me was because it was when you named your family's name. And I think you said the Brunsons. And going back 2 or 3 generations, my family also comes from the Brunsons. So if you look up your family, if they go back to South Carolina, we just might be some cousins, right? So if you see family, you know, roots in South Carolina, please email me. I got some stuff to share with you. Now, all of it's not so great, you know, including,
Awesome. And my
yeah.
mother found one extra person, another Brunson. She actually lives in South Carolina, close to her sister. And there is a Brunson who they suspect could be a cousin, but we don't have any substantiation yet. So yeah, we'll have to talk.
We'll have to talk, and we'll have to compare notes, because at the Legacy Museum in Alabama, there are a few Brunsons for whom there are markers that they were lynched. So yes, so this stuff is personal as well as professional. So what we're dealing with is not just affecting our DNA, it also impacts our identity, right? And our sense of ourselves. You know, how do I see myself in a positive light if I'm constantly being told I'm not smart enough, I'm not beautiful enough, I don't know how to parent, I'm not trustworthy, the list goes on and on and on. And at some point, it's hard to stop fighting that if you're getting it 365, you know, 24/7, 365, those negative messages. At some point, some of that creeps in. And so it's required us to deal with tremendous amounts of racial stress and trauma. So it's within that mindset that I entered into the California Reparations Task Force. So what is the task force about? Our charge, we're to conduct a 2-year study into how the state might compensate African Americans for enslavement and the lingering effects of enslavement. Secretary Shirley Weber, who was one of the main architects of the legislation, AB 3121, said that our task was to determine the depth of the harm and the ways in which we are to repair that harm. So if I were to summarize, like what are some of the main things that we are supposed to do? Our charge is to examine the period of enslavement, also the period of post-enslavement, Jim Crow, federal and state laws that discriminated against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants from 1868 to the present, Also, we're to investigate other forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed Africans who were enslaved and their descendants. We're supposed to look at the lingering negative effects of enslavement and factors that seem to be spin-offs of it. If you actually study the history, everything that happened in enslavement, there's a clear line through to the present. And so the practices that we see in the child welfare system, the practices that we see in the carceral, the incarceration system, the practices that we see in housing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, educate, everything. It has its roots and even some of its strategies and tactics. You'll see it in the present day. So we're supposed to try to understand that and make that connecting thread. We're supposed to also look at the lingering negative effects of enslavement and post-enslavement on the well-being and functioning of African Americans, and then recommend ways to educate the California public about reparations and our findings. And at each hearing, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a second of the topics that we've looked at so far, but in each hearing, we bring in expert witnesses. We invite the public to come and do public comment. We ask people to give personal testimony, and we are essentially cataloging the harms. Now, I've been studying this for 20-something years, not just with the lens of psychology. I study as much history now as I do psychology. I think I should get a second degree in history. And then I also use the lens of public health and sociology, and philosophy. And so when you do that, you begin to see the multiple ways in which this country has done harm, ways that we would not have even thought of from what we see. So I thought I knew a lot, and I'm learning a lot. And our findings will be open to the public, and there'll be 2 reports. The first report is essentially going to catalog the harms. The second report will focus more on what forms of reparations make sense based on those harms, and what we call the community of eligibility. Who should receive reparations? And those 2 things, I think the easier task has been chronicling the harms. The hardest work for us, and Michelle started naming some of those questions, is how do you actually craft the remedies, the redress? And then how do we educate the public? Because just like we as a country have had a horrible time of trying to define, to name racism and how it has operated across generations in this country, we get a grade of an F on how we teach our children history. The content of what we teach is not woefully inadequate. It is willfully and intentionally distracting from the truth. It has created a mindset for all of America that makes us think we're all that and then some in ways in which we are not. Our healthcare system, it's not the best. Our sense of democracy and our practice of democracy, it's in trouble. It's on a lifeline right now. And it's because we've been so arrogant that we're so great, and we've been taught and socialized to that our diligence, our duty to be diligent about protecting our democracy and really promoting those things that we say this country is founded on, we've lost, we've missed the boat on that. So one of the things that I'm really hoping that I can get help from this group and others like you, but I have to say you're the first I've encountered of this scope and this diversity so far, is that this notion about educating the public. So one of the things that the task force is now doing is a community engagement process, because we realized that it has not been sufficient to just get public input during the public comment, where you have 3 minutes to tell your life story, 3 minutes to give your nuanced analysis of an issue, right? 3 minutes to bare your soul. Well, that's not adequate. And then, who has time in the middle of a workday to come to a Zoom meeting and wait until you can get in public comment. So we have now launched a community engagement process that will involve 10 to 12 listening sessions that are going to happen across the state. Some will be in person, some will be virtual. In fact, I think the one for Los Angeles area is going to be in person, and it's going to be at the African American Museum. We're hoping people will come out in full force for that and provide their testimony. What does reparations mean to you? What harms have been done to you personally, or your assessment or analysis for the group? What should reparations consist of? Who should get reparations, right? And so we need to hear from the community, and we need to then use what we're understanding from the community to shape what we come up with for our recommendations. This should not just come from our heads. It should not just come from our own scholarship, and it should not just come from these experts. It's got to be from the people. So I'm encouraging you to find out when, and they'll be posted on the reparations website. It's easy to find the California reparations. Go to Google and put in California Reparations Task Force. It's going to take you straight to our page. And there you can actually look up all of the prior hearings. They're recorded, and also the testimony. So this may be useful for you for Santa Monica's work, because we did have folks talking about subject matter that's relevant to what you're focusing on. So you can actually, their written testimony as well as their verbal testimony is available on that website. But that website will also be letting you know when the listening sessions are happening. The very first one is actually going to be in a couple of weeks, MLK weekend, and it's going to be up in Sacramento. So that one's going to be, I'm surprised they're still doing it in person, but right now it's still in person. And it's going to be about 800 college students across the UCs, the Cal States, and what is the UCs, the Cal States, and I'm forgetting one. There's another, the JCs, and one other group. But in any event, we need a listening session, because most of the listening sessions are going to be focused on Black folk, talking about their perspective. We need a listening session of our allies. We need that also include the people who say, I don't buy it. I don't get this reparations. I don't think it's right. I don't think it's doable. We need to hear all of that. We need to see, can we answer and address those issues? Because at the end of the day, even with all of the things that we'll be able to chronicle about the harms that have been done, that's not necessarily going to be what moves people. What's going to move people is if we touch their hearts. And what's going to touch their hearts will be the stories of what people have had to endure, will be the pain that comes through in the telling of the story, the hope that springs from people saying, maybe finally this is going to be it, right? This will be our time. So to wrap up, because I have no idea how long I've been going. I'm a true professor. Forgive me. Just to give you a sense of what some of the things are that we have heard from already. We've had 5 hearings, I believe, and the topics that we have covered, which you again can get the information from, in our very first meeting in June of 2021, we basically that one is just mainly covering logistics and the business of running the task force. But there were some presentations on one perspective of how one might define reparations. There are others, and those other perspectives will start to come out more and more in future meetings. We had a whole focus on how to design this community engagement process. And then we had hearings starting in September that looked at things like the national and international reparations efforts. So we heard from folks who could give that perspective. Another witness panel focused on enslavement as the foundation of systemic racism. That one is pretty gut-wrenching. The Great Migration was covered in September. We had folks like Isabel Wilkerson and Douglas Blackman and others speak about that. We had another witness panel focused on political disenfranchisement, which is particularly important right now with the whole assault on voting rights. In October, we had hearings on housing and education segregation and on environmental racism. And we also had a panel on racism in banking, tax, and labor. And a fourth panel in October on the wealth gap. In December, we had a panel focused on infrastructure issues. And then a panel focused on the community of reparations, like what are some of the things we need to consider about who might be eligible, but that full conversation has not happened yet. And then we had a conversation with a potential economist, because the task force will have its own economist whose job it will be to come up with a formula. If in fact the reparations includes cash payments, what might that look like? How would that be calculated? And then finally, a task force panel on gentrification and homelessness, a panel on entertainment, arts, culture, and sports. So those are the ones we covered. The panel that's going to be in the end of this month, I think it's January 27th and 28th, will be focused on issues related to mental health, public health, and health, as well as technology and a few other topics. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grills. I just have to say for a second, my daughter, Samara, just graduated this past spring from Loyola, and she came and she's like, that's Dr. Grills. She was like, wait, what? What's going on? She had signed up to go with you to Ghana, and that trip. So
our hearts were COVID struck. And the class was supposed to, it was African psychology.
Yeah.
In the class, we were all going to travel to do some study abroad.
Right. Yeah. So she was like excited, like, oh my gosh. I had to just segue that and give a shout out. So I'm going to hand off to Robbie. She has a question, and then I have quite a few questions and suggestions that have come in, but I'm going to hand off to Robbie real quick.
Okay, so there is a lot of suggestions, but I want to get to the questions. So there's a question from Hurley Jim. Eminent domain is theft by the government. It's also a continuation of the settler colonialism that took the Latinx communities of Palos Verde, La Loma, and Bishop, where Dodger Stadium is now stands, as well as here in Santa Monica, and so more. Across the US, it needs to be seen in that context. Is there a movement to end eminent domain as part of the reparatory process, justice process? So do we know that, Dr. Grills?
That will come up when we get to part 2 of our task force process. Once we finish cataloging the harms, and eminent domain was discussed extensively during one of our hearing meetings. And so there was considerable concern that eminent domain has multiple problems. And when it is in fact implemented, it has a disproportionate impact on low-income communities and communities of color. And so I could easily see that some kind of recommendation to really redefine and, if necessary, even consider a movement away from anything called eminent domain is possible. Now, that doesn't mean that the governor and the state and the feds will listen to us, but yeah.
Christian, did I see you have a movement or your hand up, or you just stretching? No?
No, I just took 2 bites of potato.
Oh. Okay. All right, Angela, have at it for a minute.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a few questions over here, actually. I'm going to start with This one is from Lorraine Von Clan. She said, when we talk about reparations, how do we amplify both national reparations going back to slavery and repairing the ongoing harms of racism? It seems like those ongoing harms might be more local or spread out over time. So that's a question to the panel and you, Dr. Grills, and I'm not quite sure which one of you want to hop in on that.
Right. So I'll say very quickly, for the Reparations Task Force, we are actually tasked with looking at both. So we're supposed to look at the harms associated with enslavement and post-enslavement harms that come right up to the present moment. Now, one could say that's the way it needs to be, but I have to also say, and I agree with that, but I also have to say it makes our job that much more difficult because the scope is huge, right? It's almost mind-boggling.
Right, and so here's another one that goes back to that whole scope. This one was submitted by Craig Ali. He said, interested in finding how the investigation process goes into that prior to 1870, considering at that time, African Americans were not listed as human beings, but as property, consistent, with animals, cows, pigs, goats, etc. And then that's one part. The other part is, if one is fortunate enough to document their ownership, how is that process handled as well? And yeah.
Right. These are not easy questions. And please,
we can't solve the world in one evening. That's not going to happen. Like we said, right. This is definitely going to be, like you said, we'll probably dive into this at least a couple of times, but these are just,
So the records are poor prior to Reconstruction. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau has some records that allow people to do tracing, but because we were seen as property and as an investment, many of the owners actually had records where they detailed, who they had under their, who they owned, I'll put it that way. But it's very uneven, the extent to which one is able to effectively trace all the way back. So that's one of the issues that we will be grappling with as a task force, because there are some people of the mindset that reparations should only be given to folks who can trace their ancestry or their lineage or prove that they're descendants of enslaved African Americans, right? And I pose the question, I have really mixed feelings about that for a number of reasons, but one question I posed in a task force meeting when this was being discussed was, so what do we do with our children in the child welfare system who may not be able to, let alone trace back to enslavement? They may not even be able to get, actual accurate information on who their mom or dad was. And so does that mean we leave them out of the equation? There's a lot of questionable things there.
Thank you. I know one question I keep getting from everyone is if either you or one of the other panelists could really narrow down the definition of eminent domain and how it affects, how it affected, people of color now and even then. And again, you don't have to answer all the questions, Dr. Krill. We're not putting that pressure on you.
So I mean, my understanding of eminent domain is the ability of a government to basically take property away for reason, for a specific reason. And usually that falls into like greater good. So like in the case of the 10 freeway, it had a lot to do with the goals at the time of the policymakers to improve the economic nature of Santa Monica, make it something that was more well-known, and the interstate highway here. And that was the goal of at least some policymakers at that time. And so that's at least my understanding of what eminent domain is. Again, I'm not saying, you know, how I feel about it. I think that's kind of clear, but that's what I understand eminent domain to be.
I want to add to what you're saying there, and just if we go back and we look at 1948, 1949, you have law that brought into effect what we call urban renewal. Urban renewal devastated New York City. And these towers in the sky that you see in New York City they were never built well, and they were a justification and a lie to say that we were improving the city. But ultimately what it was doing was forcing people of color to live in what became the urban ghetto. In Los Angeles, urban renewal affected what happened in places like Santa Monica, or we can even attach the Dodger Stadium to this, right? This idea of improving a city, but at the expense of what? Because at the expense is forcing folks off of their property, off of their land, off of their investments, and not allowing them to recover. So eminent domain is directly attached, based off of my research, to racist laws, racist acts, white supremacy that has allowed for people of color to not thrive, but actually to live out the horrors for generations of what happens when you do that. Robbie mentioned the Inkwell earlier, and the folks who lived in the Belmont area, or the folks who lived in the area that was ultimately now the 10 freeway that connects to PCH, and everyone drives through there, and it's so pretty. It's so pretty when you drive through there, but they don't know the atrocity of what they call pretty. The atrocity and the ugly stench on Santa Monica, for example, is that the ugly stench on Los Angeles is while we enjoy those Los Angeles Dodgers at the expense of what? And we can go down the list. My grandfather built homes all through Los Angeles, and there were certain areas he was building homes that he couldn't even live in. He actually, and let me go to Orange County, where he couldn't live there either. He actually was building tract homes in Orange County and watching Disneyland be built at the same time, yet not being able to thrive in or enjoy the same privileges of the white citizens of that time, but building homes, building infrastructure. And that eminent domain is a racist governmental practice that has really decimated communities. I'll speak personally to the Black community and to my brothers and sisters in the Latinx community, and we can go on from there.
And I'll just add, you know, if folks check the October 12th task force meetings, there should be material from witness experts and testimony on eminent domain. And then also, I think it comes up again in the December 7th hearing. So it's under the topic of housing and education segregation, and then again under gentrification and homelessness. And you'll get some more from the quote unquote experts.
Thank you, Dr. Grills, and thank you, Kim, as well as Christian. That was really, really good. Now I'm going to dive in a little on regarding what reparation, what it might or might not look like here in Santa Monica. I had several questions on that. I'm not putting you on the hot spot, Christian, but these are the questions that's presented. And I know, you know, Sue is also on the call. So again, these are just questions. We're not looking to problem solve tonight, but these are just the questions that folks are asking. Specifically, this one comes from Andrina Seals. Once a previously generational family member moves into the preset units, and this is the right to return units, at that point, does the right to open a family business instead of being offered, let me see, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. She says, will those units then be grandfathered to future generations of that family? Or how does that work once you do, quote unquote, move into one of those right to return units? That's the first question. And then we'll stick with that one first. The other question was really around the right to open a family business instead of only being offered like a pop-up. So is that also something that can be looked at? And I think she means a pop-up as in like a kiosk, right? Because we now have on our 18th, 19th Pico, we're going to be able to have this kiosk in that multi-use dwelling. So the question is more so, can we look beyond a pop-up and really look at an actual more Black businesses at the end of the day? So those are the two questions I'll pose right now.
So taking the first part about the affordable housing unit, I don't believe that would be passed down to a next generation any differently than a traditional apartment would be able to be passed down.
Kristen?
So Sue, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. No, it could be passed down. It's all in the terms of the lease. And we would want that to be in the lease. Why would we grant a right to return? Let's say you had a grandparent.
Right, sorry. Oh, I just meant, I don't, like, are we restricting these, the unit specifically is going to be restricted to that family sort of in perpetuity?
No, but I think if the next generation wanted to stay in it, I mean, this is a war we have with landlords in Santa Monica all the time. We want children to be able to stay in their family home, which is that unit. Yeah.
And that's, and I think in some cases that it takes effort, but that can be done, and our rent control board works to try to ensure that that's allowed. So that's but Sue's absolutely correct. I guess we'd have to look into, and I don't know that that's the case with this current policy, that it would allow generations on to be entitled to that specific unit. And would it need to change over time, or would they have other opportunities should the family size of the next generation be larger and have a need for a larger unit? I don't believe that we've gone that deep, to be
we haven't
honest.
That's correct.
Yeah.
We haven't gone that deep. And on the business idea, I mean, we are doing everything I think we can to find the space and the funds to support, and businesses are a particular way we're trying, to support this. I think that we're going to be looking at every opportunity we have. And I'm sorry for not being on screen, guys, but I wasn't expecting to actually be in this meeting. So
that's fine.
I like to bring you in any opportunity I can, Sue, whenever you're there. I
even if it's just my picture, right? I feel like Sheldon in the big
It's a cute picture. We're happy that you're here.
I think it's fair to say, though, that we are sort of in these next phases, and as we continue to look at what opportunities are there to provide, I know that the council as a whole has talked about the issue of more access to minority businesses and ease of access through lower rents and in partnership with property owners to see how we as a city can incentivize making these opportunities more accessible to minority owned businesses. I think we're constantly doing that. And I'm not sure if we've specifically looked at it through the reparations lens, and that might be something that we can commit to doing. I'll leave it there.
Oh, thank you, Kristen. So
can I chime in just for a moment?
Yeah,
I want to say something that hits home for me, and this that I've been thinking about is, just as she's been sharing this, is I think about all the Black students, and we say Latinx now. I was about to say Latino because we said at the time, Latinx students that I went to school with, right? Of all of those folks that I went to school with, and I went to Santa Monica High School, by the way, right? I lived in Santa Monica for a long time. I was a long time Santa Monica resident. And we're talking about, I graduated with over 700 students, and there were lots of minority students on there, not so many Black students. Mostly the minority students were Latinx folks. Of all the folks that I knew on that list and I had classes with, played sports with, I can only name maybe 3 to 5 that still live in Santa Monica, and they got priced out. I moved out of Santa Monica because the rent was egregious. It was just beyond what I was willing to pay for what I was going to get. And I'm in a position now where I own a home. I don't own a home in Santa Monica because what I was going to get in Santa Monica was going to be a cubbyhole. And so I decided not to move back to Santa Monica. Now, I don't have generations of my family in Santa Monica, but I do have friends who can speak to this. And none of those folks, sadly, still live in Santa Monica. Those generations, that history that was Santa Monica is not there right now. And this saddens me. So I just wanted to add that, to add something personal of how this has affected me. All those students that I went to school with, none of them live in Santa Monica. They don't live remotely close to Santa Monica. This is a major problem that we need to continue to fight for justice on.
Tim, I think that, and I think that there are a lot of us that feel similarly, that think about this, that I think for any parents of color raising children in Santa Monica today, knowing the history of that, and I do, it's hard for them to come back and to continue to live here. I think that applies to others too. The city's gotten so unaffordable, but specifically with sort of our minority communities, you definitely see it. You're not wrong. I encounter this all the time, and I know Lana on the council and myself and others, we've talked about this. I was talking about this just yesterday with another lifelong local, and just sort of saying, and I didn't have a college fund when I went to school. I, paid for school through loans that I then had to repay. But I know that some kids, even if their parents don't have a lot of disposable income, have had opportunities for their parents to set aside from the time they were very little, a little bit, into a sort of college fund, right? So that they have something to start them off with in college. And I say, I mean, to be honest, as a parent now of a 4- and 6-year-old, I don't want to set aside money for their college. If I have an extra $20 or $100 or, at the end of the month, I want to put it into something that I can give them so that they can maybe afford to live in or near the community where they grew up. And I think there are some of us thinking about this again when I talk about that, community bank type thing, and ways that we can reinvest in people who are here now too, and the ability to create sort of a community for generations. And we've lost our way in Santa Monica a little bit. I think there are a lot of folks committed to trying to I know, people at Smart People have been doing this for a long time, trying to keep Santa Monica affordable. And it just isn't all that affordable. But we also know that people have to have more opportunity than just the ability to pay a rent or a reduced rent. They need to be able to truly lay down long-term roots. And going back to that Georgia letter, it breaks my heart that someone, all of these years have passed and they just want to come home, and haven't had the opportunity to do that until maybe now. And so I hear you, and I'd like to continue to be in conversation with you and others so that we can think about ways to allow generations of our youth to stay here.
No, thank you. This is definitely, like you said, a conversation that we're barely scratching the surface of. I wanted to bring two more points that really still speaks to how this will be collectively looked at in Santa Monica. This was a question from Andrea McPherson. She's asking, have you thought about the idea of what she's coining as a VIP club that would give those families who suffered through this crisis equal leverage with discounts per city, per the city of Santa Monica, like for food, utilities, businesses, kind of like how, say Edison already offers like that affordable, affordable discounts. So she's looking at that. And then specifically, even school property and rentals until the beneficiaries reach a certain plateau. So that is one thought there, one question there. And then the other one, and I'll stop, goes back to, again, the airport and the closure, and the question regarding looking at that as, Pinmore Golf, Pinmore Golf Course. And this one's from Tierra Ryder, as like looking at that as, an area for affordable housing, even co-op housing, just creating a space where generational wealth can begin, right? And so everyone's kind of like looking at that as like, hey, that's a potential area, if not the Civic Center again. So I just wanted to bring those two questions to the forefront as well. Or suggestions. and how, again, we're not solving Santa Monica all at once, but these are just things to think about as we look at what collectively does reparations really mean in Santa Monica. These are all, like you said, things that we'll have to really talk about in the future, but I just wanted to bring that to the forefront.
Angela, I'm sorry, Kristen.
Go for it.
Thank you. Angela, I think that when we think about reparations, when we think about what's in the word repair, and I find it quite interesting that people who are not Black or who are not so-called of color, they suddenly don't know what that looks like. But what would you want in that situation? What would you want in that situation? It's quite simple. It seems easier said than done for those who possibly want to uphold the system of white supremacy. But reparations, to repair something, means to make it look as good as new. It means to make it look the way you found it, to do your best to do that. And I still don't think that renting to someone is generating generational wealth. Even if you grandfather them into an apartment, that is still not generational wealth. And I'm speaking in the context of people who've lost land due to state-sponsored theft, eminent domain. I'm not speaking to people who, just want to live here. I mean, I have relatives who live back east who are native Santa Monicans who would love to come back to Santa Monica as well, but they're not interested in renting. So, and these are the children of, these are my aunt and my mother, the surviving children of my grandparents who would love to come back to their old hometown. But when I told them that it was, you're going to get to rent at a discounted price, their noses crinkled up, and deservedly so, because it falls short, very, 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 very short in that context, and within the context of reparations for stolen land. Stolen land. This was land that was paid for by my grandparents. They had lived in a unit. It was a duplex, and they had income property, from the other duplex, and that's gone. So, how do you then say to their granddaughter and great grandchildren and children, here's an apartment. You only have to pay $18.75 for it if you live alone. What? That's a house note in most parts of the country. You're trying to get a 1 bedroom, you know? So that we have to look deeper. I think that reparations is not just one thing, it's a bunch of things altogether, because a bunch of things have been done to us. So, you know, I'm not gonna, I don't think you should throw away the option of, you know, the right of return, because that's necessary for some people. However, if you're trying to address what's been done, you're still that still falls short. And, you know, I think that people want to get on with their lives and know that they've done something good. And there are good people in this world who respect other people and who acknowledge the horrors that have been done to Black people in this country. And they want the right things to be done, the right things to be done. It's not just one thing. Yeah, maybe it looks like give some money. Maybe it looks like, and enough to create, you know, for a down payment on some whatever, or to start a business. If you think about what was taken from my family in Santa Monica, what the actual property value would be for that strip of property that they had, which is actually still there. They just tore down the house. There's a driveway that leads to some apartments now. So they didn't even use that piece of land, but they took it just in case, I guess. So, you know, what would the actual retail price be of that land? That's a chunk in Santa Monica, since, you know, you have all these inflated property values. That's not our fault. That's what y'all did.
I just want to say it really makes me feel as a, you know, Santa Monican that's been here forever and seen people come and go, seen administrations come and go, seen lots of things. I have to say that one of the things I'm very proud of tonight is our panelists for sure. And I'll thank each and every one of them. But I thank you, Kristen and Tim, for stepping up and just saying you guys are going to connect and you're going to find a way to keep the ones, especially that are in your class, your age group that you know of, and keep them either here, you know, if they're here, keep them here, but if they're not, reach out to them and find ways to help, because, you know, Santa Monica, particularly from the 40s, was a vibrant community. You know, 50s. I know, I was born and raised here. And so that's why I created Black Santa Monica Tours. That was one of the reasons. It's because we were losing people either in passing away, but basically losing folks because of the high rents, because they were priced out, because they grew up here, they may have worked here, and then they could not live here. They could come back and work other jobs or work at the college as Tim does, as Nini does, but they could not afford to live here. And that used to hurt me so much, because their families either were here, had homes here, this whole Pico neighborhood, this whole Santa Monica. I want to just say Pico neighborhood because they were Broadway. So with saying all that to say, I don't know if it's time, y'all, to close it out. You got two more questions, Angela?
Yeah, I just wanted to share, let me see, this came from my good friend Carolina Goodman. And this question goes to Dr. Grills regarding the book, My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. And she just wanted to know your thought on that. Is Dr. Grills still on? I don't exactly see her.
I don't think Dr. Grill is still
okay.
on.
All right. Well, I don't know. Oh, have you heard about the book, Tim? Or do you have a book recommendation where folks can start to kind of dive in and wrap their heads around what we can do to move forward?
Well, from the digital space, I'll speak to that. There's to start thinking about digital literacy, media literacy, and education. There's a lot of scholarly research. My good friend at Princeton, Dr. Ruha Benjamin, is one. Race After Technology is a great book to start with, to start learning about just how we need to, when we talk about reparations, we need to talk about technology too, and education around literacy, whether we're talking about the digital space and including in that the financial space and so much more. And also look at the racist practices that are instituted by those who are dominating and creating algorithms and technology right now. So I want to just throw that in there, that is not necessarily so much so connected to the other scholarly research. But one last thing I just wanted to say, I know there was an interruption by those unfortunate things that happened. If you need somebody to edit this video and make it look clean where that is erased, you can send me the video. I'll cut it together for you, and it'll be nice and crisp for you to add to your site. I want to add that we will not allow ignorance. We will not allow racism. We will not allow those who are just here to troll and do horrific things to slow down the progress and the work of people. It is because of freedom fighters that we are here, and we must continue to do this work. So I just wanted to add that. I'm happy to do that on behalf of this group because of that unfortunate situation that happened.
You know what, Tim, normally when we expect that, we have security, we have people, IT people who handle that. And I appreciate you offering, because we may just take you up on that. It was an excellent night, absolutely wonderful. And this is not the last. We only tipped the iceberg tonight. We only tipped the iceberg. So we will be having more. We welcome you, Tim, Kristen, Dr. Grills, Camilla, who didn't get a chance to come back on from the task force, and Nini, and you know, we're gonna continue. That didn't affect us at all. This is what we do at CRJ. We have a housing committee that is so amazing. And now we're getting ready to start a coalition of folks behind this reparations. So if you want to join any of those, please put your emails in the chat and let us know what it is that you want to do. And we will, you know, connect you in the right way. And you know, we just want to say thank you for coming. Those who came, those who behaved, those who you know, who were good and wanted to get the information so they could be helpful in this tragic world that we live in. We just thank them for that. And so I think we need to go into our chant. I think that's what we're gonna have to do. You know, all of those who didn't ask their questions, please send us your questions through email. Hit us up on Facebook, send us your questions, and we'll try to get them answered for you. But anyway, let's go into our chant. Now, this chant is from Tupac Shakur's relative. Let's put it like that. He's his ancestor. And it's a chant that CRJ has kind of adopted that puts us in a good mind frame when we leave. Let us remind us of the work that we need to do. And it goes something like this. Now we start off low, and then we shout it. So let me say, y'all need to shout this to those disruptors that came on so they can hear this. Yeah, let's just say it. It goes like this. It is our duty to fight for freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love, and I'm gonna insert a word in here, cherish and support one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains. And if anybody has ever been confused, we are all in chains. Don't just think certain people are in chain. If you are in chain, I'm in chain. If she's in chain, he's in chain, we're all in chain. We're all in chains. So all of you can just say that in your seats as we say goodnight. It is our duty to fight for freedom. It is our duty to win.
It is our duty to win.
We must love and cherish and support one another.
We must love and cherish and support one another.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
We have nothing to lose but our chains.
I say, and we'll see y'all next month. with a more powerful workshop. Thank you. Good night.
Get ready, 2022.
Here we come. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Dr. Grills. Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Sue. Mayor Sue. I'm sorry. I should always say Mayor and Pro Tem. I'm sorry. I'm too comfortable. Thank you, Nene. Thank your family. Thank you, everyone. Good night.